Get going. We have our quorum, so we'll call the meeting to order. This is the Richmond Planning Commission, and it's our regular meeting for October 4th, 2023. So welcome everybody, guests. Thank you for coming, members. We will take a quick look at the agenda and see if anybody wants to adjust it in any way or make any corrections, additions. We can always put those in under other business if you think of them later. So, all
I
right.
did have something under
Yes.
public comment, or if you have a public comment.
Sure. Is this on anything on the agenda today or not? No?
No, it's from your last meeting.
Okay. Well, this is the time for public comment.
So, thank you. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to attend the last meeting. The item that I wanted to just briefly talk about relates to your conversation about multiple structures, multiple principal structures, and comment that Virginia, you made that there were objections to increased density, which was related to why some folks, including myself, have been concerned about multiple structures without any criteria attached to them. And I was pleased that you did talk about having a conditional use approval maybe applied to them. So I did want to just clarify that my concern about multiple structures is not related to density at all. I understand the density is what it is. It's really related to the process. And I believe we do have one way, which is a PUD process approval when you have multiple principal structures. And maybe conditional use will work. I just think we'll have to look at the details of that. And I certainly can understand that from a developer's point of view, with having multiple structures allowed with no other review is ideal. And I think it benefits the developer, but not necessarily the owners. And that's why I'm really wanting to just clarify my position. The property, even if you have a situation where the property owner owns multiple structures, that can change over time, and then you might have two owners with the property owners with the property, and inevitably you have things like easements and the use of the green space and the driveway and all these ways that the property needs to be able to function when you have multiple owners. So my focus really is on how the town has an opportunity, and I think somewhat of an obligation, to help guide the process through our regulations. So if the owners want to do a future subdivision, has it been set up in a way that it could be done on the lot, assuming it meets all the other development criteria, or working through the elements that have to be considered in that kind of scenario that could be covered in a PUD application.
Yeah, so Kathleen, we're going to have a whole discussion about this coming up. So your comments are definitely registered, and we will be talking about the two principal structures on the lot and its relationship to whether it's permitted or conditional, and the multi-unit housing standards, the development standards, all of those things are going to be coming up. Okay. So if you want to just...
Yeah, I'll try to attend if that can be pointed out on an agenda.
Yep, that will be pointed out on an agenda. I was going to bring that up as a topic along with a bunch of other topics under other business for future agenda items. And people can weigh in on, what they think is important, but this has come up in some other ways as well. So yeah, thanks for bringing it up. And if you want to summarize your position, but I think I get it. And it'll certainly be explored in greater depth.
Okay, thank you. I just had wanted to make sure people understood my position isn't related to the density.
Okay,
It's the
great.
project. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about that in other business and then later in probably a different meeting. So, all right. Any other comments about the agenda? If none, we'll proceed with the agenda as posted and just look briefly at the minutes of our last meeting of September 20th. Any comments, corrections, adjustments to the minutes? Okay, hearing none, we will accept those minutes into the record as written. Great. So we'll proceed with our first agenda item, number 5, our real topic, which is a presentation by our neighbors, the folks in Jericho, who can introduce themselves, and they're going to talk to us about affordable housing, which we're always concerned about. So, Sue, do you want to start off?
Sure. Hi, thank you very much for having us. It's
Yes, thank you.
fun to be kind of a fly on the wall in somebody else's planning commission meeting, having really only been to Jericho planning commission meetings. My name is Susan Brzee, and I am the current chair of the Jericho Planning Commission. And I'm here tonight with Sarah Jane Doobie, who is the chair of the Affordable Housing Committee. And we have, over the past 2 years, developed a pretty formidable partnership and have done some pretty cool things in Jericho. And I was at a dinner with Chris Granda, and I was telling him a little bit about something that we did in Jericho, which was to adopt a housing resolution. And I told him about it, and I was pretty excited about it because I felt like it was a big accomplishment. And he said that it would be great to come and speak with you guys and share with you our experience developing the resolution and where that fits into our efforts around affordable housing. So Sarah Jane and I prepared a few slides just to organize the conversation. I think you said that we'd like to be about 30 minutes. So we have this analogy of basically like building a house. Jericho as a community has been up until now pretty laissez-faire. People will help you get out of a ditch if you get your car stuck by the side of the road, absolutely. But it has been laissez-faire in terms of the town and the government making real concerted efforts to intervene in the private market, especially in the real estate market. And the town has grown over the years and has attracted residents a lot because of the quality of the schools. But as we all know, housing has become an issue. And we work together to really figure out a long-term strategy about how to build support in the town, because what we really needed to do was change the culture, and we needed to change how the select board viewed their job, and we needed to develop expertise in the town around housing, and we needed to bring the public along with us. So basically, we had to set a foundation. And Sarah Jane and I actually were not involved in setting this. We came into it, our appointments were timed such that we were tasked basically with the challenge. So initially, the select board established an affordable housing committee. Our select board chair is also on the CCRPC board. So she was really bringing some advocacy into the town. And we were also hearing advocacy bubbling up from the community. At the same time, the select board reignited a community development corp, which had been set up as a as a 501c3 corporation, it had been basically defunct, but it was set up to be able to acquire property and to be able to pursue projects that would benefit the town. And then finally, the Planning Commission, we decided as a structure that each Planning Commission member would be a formal liaison to another town committee. And for this part, I did participate in that. We appointed a once we had a new affordable housing committee, we appointed a liaison. So that's actually not me, it's one of our members. And the liaison role is, has Sarah Jane and I were, in retrospect, looking back on it, it really built the relationship over time to be able to start to really work through tough issues. It's not like we started out with tough issues collaborating for the very first time. So we have a liaison to our Trails Committee and to our Energy Task Force and to the DRB, and then we created a liaison to the Affordable Housing Committee. So the Planning Commission member attends and actually is technically, they don't have to be, but in this case is technically a member of the Affordable Housing Committee. And Sarah Jane, as the chair, frequently participates in Planning Commission meetings. So we developed a lot of rapport and collaboration over time that really started about 2 years ago. So the first thing that the Affordable Housing Committee did as a task in Jericho was to produce a housing assessment, and they modeled it on the VHFA process. So they used the data from VHFA. They have an amazing data bank, and sliced and diced it. And we're quite lucky because Sarah Jane happens to be like an analytics data oriented person. So she would come and develop very accessible information for both the Affordable Housing Committee and for the Planning Commission. So we kind of, just like a normal consulting project, we looked at the current status of housing in Jericho. And then at the same time, the ARPA money was becoming available. And so the Planning Commission and the Affordable Housing Committee, we each looked at ARPA as an opportunity. And the Planning Commission came to the conclusion that we wanted to recommend to the Select Board to direct ARPA money, some of it at least, to housing issues. And the Affordable Housing Committee, of course, came to the same conclusion. And so we then we presented to the Select Board several times over the course of several months, so that we weren't going to them at the very end with this big giant ask. We basically said to them, oh, ARPA is an opportunity. We should look at housing, and we recommended that the town take on a more assertive role related to ARPA. And so we did a joint presentation to the Select Board, and Sarah Jane and we explained the state of housing in Jericho, and we gave them like a menu of a spectrum of interventions that the town could take, all the way from doing nothing to tweaking zoning regulations to try to entice development and try to not stand in the way of certain kinds of desirable development, all the way to, at the other end of the spectrum, should the town buy property, partner with Champlain Housing Trust, allocate funds, set up a housing trust fund, like really go all in on doing something to intervene in the market. And we didn't make any sort of recommendation at that point. We just let them kind of sit with it. And we did recommend that we thought that it was time for Jericho to do something rather than just letting the market run its course, because we had 25 years of data that just showed prices were increasing. It was getting less and less affordable. The school tax funding was going to drive the tax rate very high. The demographic was getting older, all the kinds of problems or challenges that all of us are familiar with. So we, as part of that, we had invited Dominic St. Cloud from St. Albans to come and talk to the Planning Commission. And he's an amazing resource if you guys haven't met him or interacted with him. And St. Albans has done exactly that. They have taken a much more activist, interventionist approach. And the Affordable Housing Committee invited the developers of Harvest Crossing, which is a joint project between Habitat for Humanity and the United Church of Underhill, with some support from the town. So we also were looking at role models, and we were learning and then bringing that excitement and enthusiasm back into our respective committees and sharing that information with the select board to show them that other people were doing things and other people were starting to plant the seeds of success. So the Planning Commission decided to encourage the select board to adopt a resolution. And I don't know about in Richmond, but in Jericho, we don't really use resolutions a lot. I know the Burlington City Council uses resolutions all the time, and the school board uses resolutions all the time, but we've very infrequently used them. And so we learned about resolutions that it's different than an ordinance. It's basically used to state an intent or to state a desire or handle a temporary situation or give advice and so forth. And so the select board did adopt a resolution a few years ago related to Black Lives Matter. And we decided that we thought to start building the commitment around change, that we would use this concept of a resolution, because we were a full year away from a town plan update. And we had done some zoning changes based on the Zoning for Better Neighborhoods guide, but we really felt like we needed a lot more exposure and public exposure. So we developed a resolution that basically set up the facts of Jericho's housing situation, and then also set up, now what are we going to do about it? And what we said we wanted to do about it was specifically that we needed more housing in Jericho to be built. Our construction had fallen way behind. It needed to be a priority for the town. And the most important thing is that we advocated for specific construction targets. And the Planning Commission completely relied on the expertise of the Affordable Housing Committee to develop the targets. But then the Planning Commission basically went through a process of, is this reasonable? Does this make sense? And then we finalized it as a joint recommendation and presented it to the select board. And the housing targets are overall construction, and then there are sub goals for different kinds of housing. So it's not all affordable housing. It's housing in general. So the Affordable Housing Committee basically drafted the argument, and then the Planning Commission refined it. We had the Regional Planning Commission weigh in on it and helped us with some of the language. And the Planning Commission and the Affordable Housing Committee really wanted it to be action oriented, even though it's not binding. And we really had to make the select board comfortable that they were not signing up for a binding thing that people then could shake their fist and say, why haven't you gotten this done? It was really a lot about intent. And so we established targets for different types of housing, and we concentrated a lot on the missing middle, but we did also have targets for affordable and perpetually affordable and senior housing. And we also said that we wanted to diversify different housing types. And then the actions are on the right-hand side of the screen were how are we going to make this happen? Jericho is in the midst of a wastewater feasibility study. And unlike Richmond, Jericho has no municipal wastewater systems at all. And so we didn't say we need to build a system. We said we need to do the study and decide. So the whole the whole kind of strategy was baby steps and leading people along to the next greatest level of commitment that they would be comfortable with. So we didn't ask the select board to commit to a wastewater system. We just asked them to commit to making a decision about a wastewater system. We said in the resolution that we would update the town plan and zoning to reduce obstacles, that the Affordable Housing Committee and the Jericho Community Development Corp would actually work with developers to identify projects, that the housing resolution would be reviewed annually, and that we were asking that the budget and the capital plan were aligned to achieve the targets. And we wanted the housing resolution adopted before the town plan on purpose, because by the time we got to the town plan, we wanted to be able to slide the commitments of the resolution into the town plan as having already been vetted and having already been committed to. So there was a process of selling the resolution, so to speak, and building support for it. We did some public outreach, we did front porch forum. The Planning Commission goes to the farmers market a couple of times a year. The Affordable Housing Committee did outreach as well. And we basically really focused the argument for housing around people, that seniors couldn't downsize here. Young adults who want to be teachers in the school can't afford to live here. That the onus of the taxes would be onerous as we went forward, and that the resolution would be a rationale for investment decisions going forward. So instead of the wastewater study being received in a vacuum, now the wastewater study will be received within the context of, well, we've already adopted this resolution, we've already made a public statement that this is our intention, so now we're going to evaluate the wastewater study within that context. And it also gives us a way to measure success. And so we kind of built the commitment from the ground up, from each of the committees working together, and then ultimately asking the select board, and they did in fact go ahead and adopt the resolution. And then the output of that is that those targets have been established in the town plan. So we're in the process right now of adopting a new town plan. And our new town plan should be done by the end of December. And the Planning Commission just handed off the draft to the select board this week. And what the town plan does is it builds upon the resolution, and it acknowledges that the policies of the past have been exclusionary, that infrastructure, nothing's going to happen unless we invest in infrastructure. And we're going to continue to partner with the Affordable Housing Committee. So the Planning Commission will work on zoning, and the Affordable Housing Committee will continue to work with residents and the Community Development Corp. And that we will look at neighborhood development area designations around our village centers. And we also introduced an idea of a hamlet, which is because so much of the development right now is all of the incentives are based on village center development. But Jericho has 3 village centers. We don't have the core downtown that Richmond has. We're a little bit more distributed. And there are some areas near the high school. There are some sections of town that are not currently village centers and probably shouldn't be village centers, but could be very suitable for housing according to certain criteria like natural resources protection, and can they be connected with bike paths, and is it an area that's not going to contribute to sprawl by fragmenting further outlying areas. So that's kind of the town plan now is building on the housing resolution and taking it forward into more details. And I'm pretty convinced that if we were just starting with the town plan changes cold and we hadn't already done the housing resolution, that it would have been a much heavier lift, so to speak. It would have been a much kind of bigger mountain to climb. But now we've been at them, meaning at the select board, over and over and over again, building the case piece by piece, that it seems like their mindset is already around changing from that laissez-faire history to more of an investment attitude. And ultimately, whether whether a bond is approved by the voters, I mean, there's still tons and tons and tons of work to be done, but we've just basically like laid this foundation. So maybe I should stop there and see if you have questions that Sarah Jane and I could answer for you.
I do have a question. What is the scale that you're looking at here? I know that you're dealing with wastewater systems that are not municipal. So I mean, so what are you looking at? I mean, same thing, small and build out from it, or I mean that would be my question.
The
So
scale
yeah,
in
when
terms.
we were
Go ahead, Des. Go ahead.
so when we were when the Affordable Housing Committee was tasked with building targets, we were we were like 10 duplexes, I don't know. And you know, how do you kind of get at that question, and how do your point is one of the first things that always comes up at an Affordable Housing Committee meeting. We don't have any infrastructure, so how do we do this? And all of the models, you know, we're not Winooski, we're not Williston, so how do we do this, and how do we think about this? And so we pretty quickly realized that coming up with a target number of duplexes and a target number of quads and this many new apartments wasn't going to be useful. It really wasn't appropriate, wasn't something that we could do. And so we started kind of big and took inspiration from building homes together, and then tried to offer options. So first we just looked at how many new units do we need? How many new units can we support? And we looked at that a couple of different ways. One was looking at building homes together and try to understand the scope of what Chittenden County is trying to accomplish, and then our specific role in that. You know, we represent this percentage number of households. We are this distance from the concentrated development centers. We are whatever, and kind of used some of those numbers to try to get an idea for how many new units a year, how many new units over 5 years makes sense. And then at the same time, we looked at previous data for Jericho to look at some of our big boom times. So especially during 70s and 80s and IBM boom, what rate of development at some of our peak times was Jericho able to handle? And again, there's no infrastructure at that point, right? But the town was able to handle that level, and then kind of balance that out and ended up someplace in the middle. So we ended up with 30 new units a year for 5 years. And by new units, that could be a single family detached that gets rehabbed into a duplex or into a fourplex. That could be a brand new construction of a single family unit, or, you know, an apartment building, but 30 new units. And then once we had kind of decided on that, then we said, okay, how do we shift? At this point, we were starting to see, and now it's starting to, I'm sure all of you are aware, starting to calm down a little bit, but we were starting to see a lot of building happening in Jericho at a rate that we hadn't seen in a while. And we looked at those numbers, and almost everything that was being built was, you know, $750,000 when done, a very large single family home on a very large lot, not affordable to middle income families, let alone lower income families. And when we looked at our grand list to look at what our housing stock kind of had looked like overall as of 2016, we saw that what was happening was this really big shift, that Jericho actually has quite a few. There was, I think, the 2016 grand list assessment, only, I think, 45% of our houses, of our housing stock, were not affordable to middle or lower income classes. So we're really only in this higher end. And so the last couple of years, we're seeing this big shift to much larger, much pricier construction, and a real shift away from what Jericho housing stock had looked like. And so we were thinking, okay, so how do we kind of incentivize that? Housing is going to happen whether we have a housing resolution or not. They don't need our help. So let's just assume that those houses are going to be built. How do we incentivize and encourage the middle and lower income, the modest and smaller housing units to be built, and try to focus on that? And so we ended up using our grand list, looking at the percentage of houses that were currently being built and the price ranges that those were going for. We said, okay, it makes sense for Jericho to really aim for, of all of the new houses being built, knowing that we're hoping to add on to what's already being built without touching anything, right? Can we make it so that 30% are affordable to middle income families and 20% affordable to lower income families? And I don't mean perpetually affordable, but just a unit that a family making 80% of area median income or below can afford on a fair market. And so once we had kind of divided the numbers that way, then we were like, okay, we're not going to be any more specific than that. I'm not going to tell you how many duplexes I want to see. I'm not a developer and I don't want to restrict people. Creative ideas is the only way that we're going to get out of this for a town like Jericho. Really need ideas about infill or subdividing properties or whatever. So let's stay hands off, but we want to incentivize diversifying the housing stock that we have and the kinds of housing that's available. So really prioritizing and working with the Planning Commission to come up with some of those carrots, and getting rid of some of the regulatory hurdles that inhibit diverse housing types. So tiny homes, ADUs, multifamily, making sure that mixed income neighborhoods are prioritized. And then we finally did want to call out and specify perpetually affordable housing and senior housing and make some goals around that. And again, we looked at what we had, what our neighbors had been doing, what you all had, I think, 4 new perpetually affordable units come on between 2016 and 2020, to settle on a number that seemed reasonable for Jericho, which I think ended up being 10 new units of perpetually affordable. And then similarly, senior housing, which, as you all know, I'm sure, is a huge need. Many of our residents are older, their kids have moved out of town. They don't want to leave Jericho. And in order to stay in Jericho, they need a place to downsize to. And until that's there, they're going to keep their big, 3 or 4 bedroom home. And that means that a new family can't come in. So we did set a specific goal around perpetually affordable and senior housing, just to kind of underscore and prioritize those. But that's how we tried to wrap our arms around it.
I gotta launch you for the patient approach that you took with the select board. I mean, that's definitely something. But I'll be quiet here in a second and I'll let somebody else speak. We have an AR or a agricultural residential area that would specifically apply to what you're trying to do without the infrastructure. And so it's interesting to see over time how this is going to work out for you. And that's all I got.
So I have a question about your incentives. When you talk about incentives, so we've been working on removing the regulatory barriers from, suggestions in building better neighborhoods and all that kind of stuff. We haven't our Affordable Housing Committee, and Mark Hall is here, who's the chair of our Affordable Housing Committee, so he may have something to say about this, but our interactions with the select board haven't been that productive. So we may need to go back and take a longer approach. And also build more community support. We have had a housing consultant, and the people who live here were happy just the way things are, which is, I'm sure, something that you all heard in your outreach. So generating the enthusiasm on the ground or at the select board has been difficult for us. So in thinking about, when you talk about incentives rather than removing the barriers, what kinds of things are you talking about?
Well, we still have a lot of work to do. We've just done a few things so far, and those were before the resolution was adopted. So in our PUD regulations, we added a density bonus for small dwelling units that were under, I think, 1,300 square feet. And there's no requirement that it stays small. There's no other requirement. It's just that if you build it small at the beginning, that there would be a density bonus for that. And we reduced parking requirements. We added 3-unit and 4-unit multi-household buildings to one more level of zoning district on the table of uses. And we scaled down from conditional use to whether or not it was permitted. So we made it, one more level of flexibility for 3 and 4-unit buildings in certain zoning districts. That's really all of what we have done so far. What this next round of zoning amendments will look like is going to be a lot more specific around different housing types, like cottage courts and tiny houses and small units, and making more of those by right. And we are also going to look at our PUD, especially our lot sizes for within a PUD, having probably much smaller lot sizes. And we had somebody from the DRB come to a meeting recently who said he gets tons of applications for PUDs and they're all for 9 lots. And he says to the applicant, why don't you do 15 lots? There's plenty of land. We would approve that. You could get a density bonus for the simplest things. We offer a density bonus for the energy stretch code, for small units, for affordable. There's different levels of affordable, and every single one of them respond that they don't want to deal with Act 250. So we've talked about whether or not the town could subsidize Act 250 fees, or would we, and this is all just discussed at the Planning Commission level. We haven't arrived at any specific recommendations yet. We'll probably eliminate a lot of parking requirements, especially in the village center, almost completely, and just let people figure it out for themselves. Probably make more quads by right and have less conditional use review in certain zoning districts. So I would say those are kind of off the top of my head I have a whole queue of zoning changes, but definitely using the home zoning for better neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's a great help. That's been a good help, and
yeah. Oh, I should add,
on the same line that we're doing. But
the biggest change, I guess, is that I think we're coming to a place where we're not going to just rely on zoning carrots, because we've had zoning carrots and most of the time they are not pursued.
Right.
And so another incentive that we've talked about is potentially having a housing trust fund where the town could donate land so that the developer has no land cost if they achieve certain goals with the housing development? Or would we subsidize impact fees, or would we reduce impact fees? So we're going to also look at specifically financial incentives to quid pro quo, reduce costs to the developer if they produce the kind of diverse housing types that we need. And now we know what we need, and we know how many we think we should be producing.
And I would add to that too. Sorry,
Go ahead.
Susan, go ahead. I would
Nope.
add to that two things. One, just to drop a little seed, that one of the things with the Housing Trust Fund that I think is tricky for a town like Jericho is that we're a town like Jericho, and it may make sense to partner with neighboring towns to do a housing trust fund. I can't remember, maybe you all know better than I do. There's two towns, I think they both start with W's, that have partnered up to do a housing trust fund together, so that because you may not be able to get a large enough fund with just somebody small like us, but if we can partner with Richmond, with Underhill, Essex even showed some interest, and then we can get a larger pool of money going. A housing trust fund may actually be feasible for us and a really and useful for big projects like this. But I could also see it being useful for, we've got a number of communities who have neighborhoods who have community wells, and their wells dry up, and they have these huge costs, and they need to be able to either get a grant or, there's lots of things that I think a housing trust fund can do, both for current residents and the current community, in addition to developing new. The second thing that I just wanted to say, which wasn't a direct answer to your question, Virginia, but was that what Susan and I found was that it was really important to be offering examples and ideas and of possible solutions. I think the housing crisis is big. It's impacting the whole country. And so what are we as a small town with no infrastructure? What could we possibly do? It feels really overwhelming and daunting. And so eventually, at first, I think I at least was a little nervous about providing this spectrum of action, I think is what we ended up calling it, which was just like a brainstorm of every possible thing we could think of to do. But when you look at it, first of all, it's overwhelming. There's lots of things you can do, which is great. But also, there were some really easy things that we could go through and be like, yeah, we can do that. And we built a website that just put all of the resources for building ADUs all in one place and gave you kind of a walkthrough of how to do it in Jericho. Like lots of little things like that seem really feasible. And then, as Susan said, you walk along that spectrum and things get a little bit bigger, and you start talking about things like housing trust fund, but making sure that people understand that there are things that we can do that at least create an environment where solutions are possible, where developers who want to come in and be creative, or that one kid that grew up here wants to come back and raise their family next to the grandparents, and they're willing to, build a house and live in one room as they add to it. So the possibility for those kinds of solutions exists, is helpful in trying to kind of build support, so that, we're not just dumping a big problem on them. And I will say, and Susan has spent a lot of time, most of the people who come to Affordable Housing Committee meetings are interested in affordable housing, whereas Susan spent a lot more time in talking about the town plan with the community. But our neighbors see the housing problem. They want their kids to move back and have their grandkids next door. There is, I think, a real shift in the appetite for change. I don't know that it's as scary as it once was. And I think that it's actually directly impacting people now in a way that it wasn't before. And I think there's been a shift. I don't know if you agree, Susan.
Okay, Mark Fausel had a comment, and then Chris, and then Mark Hall. So Mark Fausel, did you want to say something? Your hand went up and then it went down.
It did, and then I thought, well, maybe we'll write it out and I'll just look it up on my own. But since I got you in a few minutes, I'm curious about the density issues. A couple things you brought up were incentives, one of which was density incentives. And my familiarity with Jericho is there's pretty much one water system. And then everybody else is on wells. I think there's two, maybe is there another two private systems? But anyways, most of your landmass is not. And I was wondering with these density bonuses, whether they factored into, or your concentrated growth efforts even, whether they factored into keeping them within pre-established public utilities, or whether you're pretty much going town-wide, and whether those density bonuses are applicable for I think don't you guys have some pretty large lot districts? So that'd be question number one.
So the PUD density bonuses are pretty consistent across the whole town, except for affordable and senior housing density bonuses are greater. There's more density bonus available in the village center. It's true that the lack of water and the lack of septic is a limiting factor. And so that's kind of the conclusion we came to. We could loosen up the zoning and it still wouldn't solve the problem. Or we could bring in infrastructure, and if we didn't fix the zoning, it wouldn't solve the problem. So we have to address both. We do have a 10-acre lot size in a lot of the town in our rural agriculture district. And the PUD, if you do a PUD in that district, I think the minimum lot size is an acre. And so even in a PUD there, an acre is still like a pretty big lot. And we have two water districts here, and then some of the neighborhoods, they have homeowners associations and they do have shared wells. So we have a decent number of neighborhoods where the developer built a shared well for the neighborhood. But I think the goal, the new town plan does a much better job of defining the growth area and setting forth investment in infrastructure, in water and septic, to facilitate growth to happen there and not as much in the outlying areas.
And part two of that question would be your discussion about multi-unit dwelling and where you'd be allowing that. And I was wondering how you guys felt about the density bonuses and how that would work. So if you allowed a PUD for, say, 3-4 unit buildings in the 10-acre zoning district, 12 units in 10 acres, is that the kind of thing you're heading towards, or are you really trying to focus the multi-unit dwelling again in your village centers and pre-established at least drinking water community areas?
Yeah. Multi-unit like duplex is allowed everywhere in Jericho. And so we were ahead of the Vermont state legislation that made that a requirement. We did that a couple of years ago. And then triplex and quad are in, if you think about the the spectrum of zoning districts. Up to a quad is pretty much not village center, but adjacent to the village, and then duplexes everywhere. So currently you can't build a quad out in the ag district, really. The zoning defines a multi-unit structure that 2 units counts as 1 unit. So if you were doing a density calculation and you were building a multi-unit structure, 2 units counts as 1 unit. So a quad would count basically as 2 units. But I'm here to tell you the language is very unclear, and it needs to be fixed. Because when you go to DRB meetings and they're doing density calculations, it's really difficult. And I am really totally open to the idea that density limits might not be the right tool in every location, because by distributing, like especially in our large lot areas, by having, you know, a 10-acre zone, you need 100 acres to build 10 houses. But if those 10 houses are on much smaller lots, does it really make sense for the PUD to, well, currently the PUD requires 50% or more to be open space. It just seems like there's something wrong with the math. I haven't found, other than, you know, a lot of places don't regulate density at all. It's more of a form. We do have a form-based code in one of our village centers. And in that particular case, there, you know, the density limits are very obscure. And I think we should look at that. I think we should look at whether or not, when does density really provide the public benefit that we think it provides, versus when does it just spread everything out?
Yeah, we could
Then
have
trying-
a week-long conversation on this topic that
Yes.
about density language, especially density language that we have been wrestling with. So,
Mhm.
Well,
Chris.
thank you. We can move on to Chris, I think was
Yep,
next.
Chris, and then Mark, and then we'll try to wrap it up, I think, after that, although we could go on for a long time. It's a great conversation, and
I do just want to make one comment as we think about multi-unit, as we think about affordable housing. I understand the reason to focus on village centers and access to infrastructure and amenities, et cetera. Although in a town that has very limited infrastructure and amenities, I'm not sure what that argument is, but being really careful to think about equity and think about what it says, that we're only focusing on allowing certain households and certain housing types in very specific areas of town and not in other areas of town, is just something that I think we should all be cognizant of as we have the conversation.
Agreed. Chris.
Thanks. I'd actually like to defer to Mark just to make sure he gets his questions in. And Mark, I appreciate your attending tonight and taking advantage of this. So go ahead.
Great, thanks, Chris. Yeah, Susan, Sarah Jane, right? Yes. Thank you for joining tonight. Question about, I know you talked about the kind of the slow roll of information to the select board in town, but what types of public outreach or outreach beyond that, or conversations did you have with members of the community? I'm curious to hear a little bit about that.
Do you want me to start, Susan?
Yeah.
This is something that has been really important to me, and I wouldn't give myself an A as chair of Affordable Housing Committee. So I'll preface it with that. One thing that we did a lot of was doing a speaker series and advertising them. And so inviting someone from Champlain Housing Trust to come and talk and explain what the shared equity program was. It was actually a really well attended meeting. A lot of people had misconceptions and asked very thoughtful and respectful questions and got some of those misconceptions cleared up. But it started a conversation that I think for some was a little scary. And so bringing in different speakers and advertising them to the public was one way to just get the public to engage in our committee meetings, and was also, a way to provide education and start conversations. Another thing that I started doing, and then I just started to burn out, but I really hope I hope other members of the committee will start doing it as well, and I hope to pick it back up, is meet with particularly landowners, but anyone in the community who's been thinking about these questions, developers, folks with large plots of land, and just say, hey, what do you think? Or what have you run into? Or let's grab a cup of coffee and talk. And it started out because I was new to municipal government and new to housing. And so part of it was me just saying like, hey, I'm the new kid. And some of the folks I talked to have been here for decades, and, their families have been here for generations. And like, I'm the new kid. What do you want me to know? And what do I need to learn? And those conversations were some of the most productive and really, I think, got me some goodwill and a level of trust when we started doing these bigger projects like the housing resolution, that some of these folks really felt like we were engaged and invested in what they had to say. And I think it helped that I'm a new kid, because I don't have the 5 years of fighting with the DRB and I'm not a part of the history. That I come from a small town where, the way that my mom was in second grade is how I was expected to be in second grade. I get that. And so I do think that helped, but really those one-on-one conversations have been crucial. And I'm surprised that just a cold call or a cold email, I've had a lot of them, and they've been really great. And I think that, I'm hoping that we can do more organized forums. So I'd love to do an ADU forum. If you Heinsberg did one a year or two ago that sounded really great. If you guys are interested in partnering and doing a forum together, that would be great. But just some community events, holding people's hand while they fill out some of the grants that are available to them, offering some cider and donuts and saying, hey, here's the weatherization grant. I know it's a beast to fill out. Come to the community center. We'll all do it together and put it in the mail so you can take advantage of this money. Those kinds of things. All right, Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, my answer is more, we use the formal process for the planning commission. So we basically had 3 big events, or 3 big milestones: the housing resolution, the ARPA recommendation, and the town plan. And for all 3 of those, we use Front Porch Forum and we publish our agenda, but we don't publish the agenda. We put the agenda into layman's terms, and we say, we're going to talk about housing, and we're going to talk about the school is the largest employer and teachers are having trouble finding housing here, and to entice the community to come into the conversation. And we adopted a housing resolution, and we wrote an article for the Mountain Gazette. So before, we had dozens and dozens and dozens of meetings where housing was a topic. We had a housing online survey related to the town plan, and we had a work session on housing related to the town plan. And all of those we publicized on Front Porch Forum. So as SJ said, most of the comments that we got were confirming that most people think that housing is a problem. Of course, nobody's asking to build a 15-unit building in their backyard. So I'm fully expecting that we're in the honeymoon stage right now. We've kind of like done the easy part. We haven't, and I think we have tested the limits with pictures and unit sizes that we started to encounter resistance when we were showing buildings in the like 9 to 12 unit size. 4 and under, it seems like everybody thinks that's a great idea. Like I lived in a 4-unit building when I first graduated from college, and I'm sure all you guys did too. So we made a really big point of not doing any us and them. We don't really talk about affordable housing. We talk about housing that's affordable for lots of people. But we used a lot of publicity around Planning Commission events, traditional media, and Front Porch Forum, mostly.
Did your select board adopt the resolution, or was it voted on by the town?
The select board adopted it.
Just adopted it. Okay. Yep. Okay, Chris, do you want to make a last comment, and then we'll have to move on a little bit, but it's a great conversation.
Yeah, this has been a wonderful conversation. And thanks, Sue and SJ for coming. My question is pretty straightforward. It sounds like you mined the grand list for data, but were there other important data sources that you tapped that you would recommend? Just on telling the story about what's happening with housing in town, because I think one challenge, well, I don't know, Virginia or other members, if you would agree with this, but I think what we see sometimes is people, will say, and sometimes it's the same people who will say, oh, I like my neighborhood just the way it is, on one hand, and then on the other hand say, oh, my kids could never afford to live here. I wish that, it's different. And there's not really a full appreciation that to do nothing means to allow market forces to continue to act and to continue to move everything in the direction of more expensive housing.
I think one of the things that we've started doing I just have a file of every Front Porch Forum post asking for housing. And often it describes and I hate to say it, but I think it's important to acknowledge that most of those posts describe the family unit or describe, who these people are. And, I'm a teacher at JES, and I start in the fall and I need a place to live. And it humanizes it instead of, the folks who want to be our neighbors, and pointing out that many of these folks are folks that we interact with every day, who work in our schools, who work at the new market. I think that helps. One of the other things that I think was really helpful was going to the school is one of our largest employers, looking at the salary for a new teacher, a new staff position there, and saying, okay, so say you've got a dual teacher household. This is how much they're making. They can't afford to live here. But, kind of making it a little bit more personal to explain. And I had another thought, and now I've lost it.
Well,
Susan.
VHFA was a huge data source.
The data source. Yeah.
The data,
housingdata.org is just, I could spend all day in there.
Yeah.
There's great stuff in there.
Yeah. That's unbelievable. We also addressed that issue around change head on. We said, everybody says they don't want Jericho to change, but if we don't do anything, Jericho is changing, and it's going to change in a way that we won't recognize it in 10 years, because currently the socioeconomic profile is X. This is what SJ was talking about earlier. But the socioeconomic profile of a new buyer is Y. And there's a tremendous difference between those two things. And so if you like Jericho the way it is, you need to do something. It's sort of like taking the argument and turning it around the other way, because like SJ said, a lot of the houses we currently have here, the existing stock is pretty affordable or missing middle, that we have a lot of really great neighborhoods, and the town plan says, let's make our zoning match the neighborhoods that we all really love. Like the current zoning, you couldn't build those neighborhoods today. That's crazy when those are everybody's favorite neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. Well, I hope that we can all stay in touch because we all have the similar problems and different wrinkles to the problems. We have Act 47 that we're dealing with, which is a help in one sense and a hindrance in another, which deals with towns with infrastructure. So the density question, we definitely all need to talk about. So thank you both very much for coming, for your work, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from us some more.
Sure. You too. Thank you
As
for
we
your work. And hopefully
go on this
in a few
path.
years, we'll have some infrastructure too.
Yeah.
That's the
There you
goal.
go.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Have a good rest
All
of
right.
your
Good
day.
evening, everyone.
Thanks
All
so
right,
much.
good night.
Yeah.
Sure.
Good night. All right. Well, that was an excellent presentation. Hope it's given us all some ideas and things to do, more things to put on our to-do list. And we could have gone on for the whole rest of the hour, but I did want to get on to our next agenda item because I'm hoping that we can make some forward progress on this issue. So if we could just turn our thinking a little bit to a proposal actually that involves increasing housing, which is a good thing. And it's a discussion of the proposed amendments and the bylaw report on the residential uses in the industrial commercial neighborhood that we've been working on, the Rogers Lane question. So I wanted to start by just briefly looking at the amendment report, the bylaw amendment report, because it states the point of what we're doing. This is something, Keith has got the amendments up there. I just want to briefly refer to the bylaw amendment report in which you have to include your point. What is your point? There's a couple of questions that the state requires you to answer when you're amending your bylaws. And basically, this one-page report, do you want to put that up? Do you have the bylaw amendment report right there? Keith, you could put that up and we could just look at it, basically. So, a brief explanation of the purpose of it. It proposes to amend 2 sections of the zoning. Section 3.7, which is the industrial commercial district, can you put the report up there? Yep, there you go. So in that first paragraph, the first and the second paragraph, it proposes to amend section 3.7, which is the industrial commercial district itself, and section 512, the planned unit development and residential planned unit development section. And the purpose is to allow additional residential uses on lots that already host residences in this district, utilizing the PUD process that we're going to amend here, but it retains the primary emphasis on non-residential development. In other words, so we still have a commercial area that's set aside, retains the land for future commercial purposes, but allows needed additional housing on lots that developed prior to zoning. So that's the point. Hopefully we'll all keep that in mind, that that's what we're trying to do. Then a little further down, we go on to say that it reflects a growing concern with the shortage of housing in Chittenden County. So the new housing that we're going to create here is going to be in areas that already have houses. So it's safely in a kind of a neighborhood structure. We still have opportunities for commercial enterprises to be maintained but we're providing them with some flexibility, which we'll get into in a minute. And I point out that there are no true industrial uses in this district anyway, and it's not really suitable for heavy industry because of the proximity of the big Riverview Common neighborhood and all these residential lots that exist already. So anyway, so that's just a statement of why we're doing this. So I want to now go, Keith, if we can have the actual proposed amendments back. And I am hoping that we can agree fairly quickly on what we want here and move it into our public hearing stage. So here's what we're proposing. Section 3.7, which is the industrial commercial district itself. There are two changes that we need to make this fly. I'll go on to the second one first, 3.7.20, planned unit development as provided in section 512, and then we are crossing out the line that says if no subdivision of land is proposed, because that would not be possible to be utilized by the Donovans because they are proposing a subdivision. So Keith and I could not really find a good rationale for keeping that language in there. So we would like to eliminate it and allow you to use the planned unit development, whether or not a subdivision is proposed. So that's the first major point. The other point is the one right above it, 5.7.2H, where we have put in the uses table that the dwelling units as part of a PUD or a residential PUD as provided by section 512 is a use. So this does two things. It confirms what is already stated in the current PUD section, which says a residential PUD is allowed in this district. It states that, dwelling units are a use. In order to have a residential PUD, you have to have dwelling units anyway. So it makes it clear it is now on the use list. The other thing that it does is it allows for PUDs, not residential PUDs, but regular PUDs in the rest of the IC district that contains some dwelling units. And we talked a little bit about this last time. We didn't come to any conclusion. Keith and I talked about it a bunch. Really didn't feel that there was any reason not to allow PUDs with some commercial and some residential, that's mixed use PUDs, in the rest of the district. For instance, Jay Hutchins wants to build a new warehouse structure and put a couple of apartments above it. That seems useful. What we have done, as you will see in the PUD section, is borrow the language from the Village Commercial District PUD, which says 50% has to be commercial. So we have, down in the PUD section, allowed you to have dwelling units, but at least 50% of your PUD has to be commercial. We felt this gave some flexibility. You could have a mixed use. You can't have residential PUDs in the rest of the IC district, but you could have mixed. All right, so you all can think about that. Those are the two items that would have to be changed in the district itself, 3.7. So then we come down to 5.12, which is the planned unit development and residential PUD section. So the important part here is this in B, the red, which says PUD shall be allowed in the JC and VD districts. That doesn't concern us right now. A PUD or a residential PUD shall be allowed, and this is language that already exists in this section, in the Village RC, the Gateway RC, the Village Commercial, the Commercial, or the IC districts. That is pre-existing language. But we have added the key sentence, which is, however, in the IC district, a residential PUD shall be allowed only on parcels that are occupied and solely occupied by a residence or residences as of the date of the adoption. So this was what we all seemed to be okay with last time, which was you can have a residential PUD already allowed in the current zoning, but only on lots that have residences already. And some of the language that is crossed out subsequent to that in B has been moved to other places. This PUD section was very disorganized. There were pieces conjoined in sentences that didn't actually belong together. So when you look at this amendment, whatever is in black is language that already exists in the current PUD, but it may be in a different place from where it is in the current document. So it's organized to make sense. For instance, all the parts that relate to residential PUDs have been gathered together one after another so that it makes better sense. Chris.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand what this would allow. So
Yes.
So it would allow a PUD to be formed in the IC district for parcels that already have residences on them, and that in turn would allow the subdivision of those parcels.
Correct.
A residential PUD, yeah, we're talking about a PUD or a residential PUD would be allowed on a lot with a residence on it, which could be subdivided or it might not be subdivided.
Which only has a residence on it. That only
Right.
is operative.
Only
Yep.
a residence. It cannot also have a business on it, and it cannot be unoccupied. So
Oh.
that if there are any unoccupied pieces of land, or for instance, say Jay Hutchins cuts off a lot that is unoccupied now, that could not have a residential PUD on it.
Would there be a value to making that possible?
Actually, let me think about that for a second. It has to be occupied and solely occupied by a residence as of this date. So if you were subsequently after the date to create a lot which then had nothing on it, it doesn't seem like that would be prevented from developing a residential PUD. What do you think, Keith?
Oh, I think it does. I think once you have that, you have the shall be allowed only on parcels that are occupied and solely occupied by a residence. I think that's pretty strong for us to administer.
And I guess if you subdivide the lot later, you have to take it back to how it was at the date of the adoption of this ordinance.
Yes.
So everything reverts to the date of this ordinance. So if it was a lot that had a commercial business on it as of this date, you could not put a residential PUD on it. You could put a regular PUD with 50% commercial
Yep.
and 50% residential. Does that answer your question, Chris?
I think so. Thank you.
So the other key point, Mark, you wanted to speak about this?
I did, yeah. I'm just thinking in the same vein about we're specifying only for the IC, but don't we have this issue? And I'm not familiar with where those locations are in the commercial district where there are sole residential pieces of property. And we would then want to be able to allow residential subdivision on pre-existing residential properties in the commercial as well as the IC.
Well, we could do that. I mean, I didn't put that in because of our pre-existing desire to only focus on districts that we were talking about to make changes in. But you know that I would like to make these things both the same district anyway, so that
It's
that
a step
would
towards that, but
it
also would
could
add
be a
some
step.
clarity to the commercial district.
Well, that's
If
fine.
that's in
If
the
people,
same big gray area that we now have the IC district, let's
And
define them both in that
the-
same manner.
the commercial district has the exact same kinds of situations. They have some lots that have only residences and some lots that have both and some lots that just have commercial. So I would be perfectly delighted to make that change for the commercial district as well as a step towards eventually, you know, whatever.
I think
So-
it makes sense to eliminate the grayness of this interpretation of this regulation, because it talks about having residential PUDs allowed in the commercial. So what does that mean?
Right.
I mean, here we are defining it in the IC and saying, well, it's for properties that have residential use in it, but it leaves the commercial hanging and not knowing.
Right. It leaves the ambiguity there.
Yes,
So
and that's bad.
all that would require is very easy, would be up there 3.7.2. We would just have to then go to the commercial district and make those two same changes. We would add a dwelling unit as a use as part of a PUD, and we would remove the requirement that there be a subdivision. So we could do that quite easily in section 3 point whatever it is, 6 or whatever the commercial
What the rest
district
of the
is.
commission thinks about that.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that in a minute. And the other thing that you would have to do is down there in 512 to B, you would say, however, in the C and the IC district, it can only be a residential PUD on lots where there are residences only. So, do other people want to have a comment about that? I would be fine with that myself. I think it would help clear up the ambiguity that already exists by saying you can have a residential PUD and then not listing dwelling uses as a use, which is kind of a
Then
problem.
we call out IC, but we don't call out commercial. That's twice as bad.
Right, yes. Well, I'm all for consolidating these things so we don't have to come back and do the whole thing over again for some other district. What do you think, Keith?
I think that adds to the burden that we're trying to get to now, because that's a change to the map. Right now, we're just changing the uses and the language in the PUD section. We're not changing the maps.
No, we're not changing the map.
no.
We wouldn't with Mark's suggestion. We're just changing this. We're just adding this language
Oh, I have no
into
idea.
the C district.
Oh, I thought the question was to combine the districts.
No. I'm sorry I brought that up.
Yep. Yep. That's fine. Fine.
Mark's point was only, let's make this exact change also to the C district to remove
Fantastic.
the ambiguity that it resides there as well.
Fantastic. Yes.
Okay. All right. Anybody else want to have a comment about that? All right. So while you're thinking about that, if we move on down this document a little bit, there's one other thing. Okay, go further down to number F. Okay. And this is possibly considered a technical fix, but what it says currently, the language in the PUD section says that the uses that may be allowed are the ones on the list. Well, that doesn't say anything about the ones that aren't on the list, whether they might or might not be allowed. It's vague language. So what this says is basically the uses proposed for the PUD shall be only those on the list. Not you may use the ones on the list, because then what about the other ones? May you or may you not use them? This just says you have to use the uses off the list. So I'm hoping that that is clear, because the language that we object to is what I crossed out in G, which says the DRB may authorize multiple uses. Blah, 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 blah. Where is it? Anyway. So, yeah, basically we're saying the only uses that you can utilize are the uses on the list.
I'm gonna pop this, I'm gonna magnify this a little bit better. There you
Yeah.
go.
And another thing that was an ambiguity in the PUD section was in current G, which says multiple uses may be allowed on all lots, but it didn't even list the C and the IC district. This was for regular PUDs. It didn't say anything about the C and the IC being able to have multiple uses. Well, obviously on a PUD, you're going to allow multiple uses.
Yes, if it's a mixed use project,
If it's
yeah.
a mixed use, so we have to list the C and IC as allowing multiple uses. And this paragraph G is where it says, provided that the multiple uses comply with the PUD standards and other specific criteria of these zoning regulations, that's already in there, and state law. And then in the village commercial, and then I have added the commercial and the IC district, at least 50% of the gross floor area must be in commercial use. So they said nothing about the C and the IC. So I borrowed that language to allow you to have a PUD of mixed use with some residences, but you still have to have 50% in commercial. Now, the other language that's already in here that could be adapted is in Jolena Court and the Village Downtown districts, it states that the residential uses can only be the second floor and above, or the basement. In other words, in those districts, your commercial uses have to be on the ground floor, or your ground floor has to be in commercial uses. We felt that that was more of an urban thing. You know, it's walkable, and you have your commercial uses on the ground floor because they're visible, and then you have residences above, as we have on Bridge Street or Jolena Court. Their ground floors have commercial style windows, except Jolena Court has planted large hydrangeas in front of their windows, so you can't see anything in the building. But be that as it may, the first floor of Jolena Court and the first floor of the downtown block has to be commercial. It seems like in this outlying area, that's not the case. People don't walk around J. Hutchins looking in the windows. So it seemed like the better metric to use was to say that 50%, any 50% of this building had to be in commercial space. But I'm open to either adding the other thing as well, so that all the commercial has to be on the first floor, or using some other kind of standard such that since we could allow them to put some residential in a mixed use PUD, but we still want to control it to have commercial as well. So this seemed like a good solution. It was already in the zoning. It's, you know, currently in the language, the 50%. So that seemed like a reasonable standard to have. Anybody have any thoughts about that? I'm not seeing everybody on the screen. Do we have everybody here?
Yep. Adam, Allison, Michelle, Chris.
Okay,
I'm
so,
here.
if, are there any hands up? Keith, tell me if there's any hands up.
That's a good question. No, there are not.
Okay. All right, here's some people who have appeared on the screen. Chris, Adam, do you have any thoughts about this? I mean, the two things that we left a little bit unresolved last time was, should we allow PUDs that are mixed in the rest of the C and the IC district if we're going to talk about them both? And so I elected to put them in this version with the caveat that 50% has to be commercial. If we want to add the C district, that's fine. If people have comments about that. I don't think there are any other things that are controversial. All the rest of this language is taken from the current ordinance, rearranged a little bit differently.
This may be controversial. The master
okay.
plan.
All right. So before we get to the master plan,
Okay.
5.12.4, are there any comments about the rest of this document? I'm hoping everybody has had time to look at it and sort of study it and see what you think about it. A few minor changes, like in number H, the current language just says the DRB may impose conditions to ensure that a residential PUD does not place an unreasonable burden on the ability of the town to provide municipal or governmental services. I did add a PUD. Why not? Why do we only want a residential PUD not to put a burden on town services? Do we want a regular PUD not to put a burden on town services? It seemed like,
Pretty squishy.
yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that
What's
the
considered?
zoning administrator would hate, but the DRB is going to have to deal with it
Yep.
and decide whether it does or doesn't.
I mean, I guess most of it seems like a pretty elegant solution to a problem we wrangled with a bunch. Obviously, the last part you touched on with allowing PUDs in all portions is not as straightforward.
What is not as straightforward?
Oh, the allowing residential PUDs in all portions of the C and IC districts. But I mean, I have pretty strong opinions on that. I think it's a great option. But I'm sure that's not shared by everyone. But I think the previous part we talked about just allowing, kind of clearing up the language, is a pretty elegant solution.
So, Adam, are you saying that you are okay with having mixed use PUDs in the rest of the district?
Yes, that's what I was saying. I do think it's important to keep them. I do think it would be an important distinction to have them be mixed use PUDs and not just allow blanket residential PUDs everywhere in the C and IC districts. But I think mixed use PUDs would open up quite a bit of opportunity.
Yeah, and options definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, I guess a lot of the disagreement might come down to like what we envision those districts doing. But I think, other portions of town where we have a lot of mixed use seem to be the most vibrant parts of our community, where we pull people together, we have people in the areas, and then we have mixed uses. A lot of that might be proximity to other neighborhoods, but I think that that's worth exploring, because it opens up options and allows more housing, possibly, while also keeping commercial and industrial commercial stock there.
And so
I think it's a good option.
You see that in this document, and you're okay with that. You see that residential only where their residence is mixed in anywhere.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Yes, that's correct.
All right, Mark.
Hey, see, that's why I keep my camera off, because when I'm staring into the trying to read along here, I got 3 inches from the
Right, I know what you mean. That's kind of
and all
small.
you see is my bulge.
That's a good tip, Mark. I'll have to remember that.
So here I am. I'm just wondering about mixed uses, and that language has got me thinking about, I mean, we're pretty clearly defining that a residential PUD can only be done on pre-existing residential properties.
Correct.
But we also say that if we're going to allow uses, residential uses as part of a PUD, and we allow a property to submit an application for a PUD that would include residences, which is all legitimate, then all of a sudden we have subdivided separate properties that are just residences.
Well, you still have to have the 50% requirement for commercial.
Okay, so you go
Yes,
for
sir.
a subdivision, and but you'd still be, it would still be possible to parse off individual residential lots in a mixed use PUD of a current residential property. No, I'm sorry, not residential property. It's a pre-existing business property. And
So-
through the process of a PUD, we're parsing off residential lots that are solely residential. Now, they then again cannot subdivide, because we're saying, you know, we're setting that date of implementation of these zoning regulation changes. But I'm not even sure what I'm
You're on
processing here, but I
Yeah.
kind of want the whole board to sort of
Yeah.
process.
I guess I was under the understanding that each individual lot broken up in the PUD would kind of be the combined, so like a combined residential commercial on each lot if it went through the PUD. I guess if we
Yeah.
were to allow what Mark's saying, that might, I guess I'm not inherently, my knee-jerk reaction isn't to be opposed to it, but I'm definitely not, my knee-jerk reaction isn't to be in favor of it either. I think that would take a little more thought.
If you
I was kind of
require,
envisioning more of each, you know, if you were to do a PUD in each lot that came out of it could have a different mixed use, but each lot would have a mixed use on it, not the entire PUD would be 50% mixed, 50-50 mixed use. I think that's, and I don't know if that's how that works, Keith, you can speak to that more, but if that was the case, I think that would take some much more careful consideration, because that could be a lot different setup.
you would have to require the residential to be on the second floor to totally eliminate that.
Gotcha. So what Mark's kind of getting at would be kind of within reason based on what we're talking about, or?
Yeah, because you're allowing the subdivision.
I'm
Yeah.
not convinced that that's the only way to forestall that eventuality. That there would be language that could require for each lot subsequently created 50% of the gross floor area of buildings on the lot would have to be in commercial use. On any lot that is created after this date that we have, or, I mean.
That would fix it too, yeah.
So I think
that how
there
you-
are ways to make sure that you can't then take any of the commercial lots or undeveloped lots and cause them to become fully residential. I think there's language that can be developed that will prevent that. Would that meet your needs?
Yeah, I
If
think
you
so.
can-
Is it in there now almost? I'm just not quite sure about how I read this, whether we're preventing that as it is right now, or whether we want to add an extra line that says, to be clear,
Yeah.
a commercial property cannot, even though the original building has, the original lot has 50,000 feet of commercial, that they can go through a PUD and then create, 5 lots of 10,000 square feet commercial of residential.
But it would be
50%.
but it would be reasonable to do a PUD and maintain that one same lot and do residential on that lot. That would be without subdividing. Does that make sense? That would work?
Yeah,
Yeah,
if it's
so-
on the same lot, I guess that would minimize it to a degree, yeah.
I guess
And
what
I
I-
think if someone were to do that, the logical thing would be to put that residential on the second floor. It just makes sense.
I was just the reason I was thinking about this, Mark, actually I was kind of opposed to it. And I was talking of a friend that lives in Milton, owns a sawmill. They have a huge commercial sawmill, and they have a bunch of people working there, and finding housing's been a nightmare, and they're having the same problem of they were going to just build housing. Well, it's zoned industrial commercial, or industrial, I guess, for the sawmill, and they can't build any residential. And so they would have employees that could have free housing right there. And it was kind of, so I don't think we're going to get a huge commercial sawmill in Richmond anytime soon. But the idea of that flexibility, I think, with how the labor market and housing market's going, seems like an intriguing option. But I do think the idea of just dividing lots off and making them residential is a little bit of a sticking point for me. But it sounds like we're all kind of on the same page with that.
Right. I mean, you could spell it out such that, for instance, in your sawmill guy example, maybe in that case, let's say they had 10 acres and they had this 50% rule and they weren't going to subdivide, but they wanted housing for their people. They might want to put the housing way over there in the
Sure.
corner. You know what I mean? Like at the far edge, if it was retained as one property. Now that would make sense. It's not on the second floor, but it's better in that situation for it to be remote, but it still provides them with housing. So you could put language that says if you're retaining the lot without subdividing, you just have to have 50% in commercial. If you're subdividing, every subsequent lot has to have 50% commercial.
If you're going to have mixed use, you could also stipulate that if there's a residential component to your PUD, that there is no subdivision allowed. If there's I know that that's starting to, we're going to need to craft some language on that one. I think what we're getting at, or I'm getting at. I think there's a couple
Yeah,
of
I
ways.
mean, you could say that you can subdivide, but you can't, on any subsequent lot. So like your sawmill guy, now he wants to get rid of the housing. He wants to subdivide that part of the lot off where he's put the housing. But he has to have 50% on the new lot has to be in commercial use. So he
Whatever
can
that looks
either
like.
start a new business there, or he can change the half of the units. He put 4 units. Now he's going to change 2 of them into commercial space. If every
I guess-
subsequent lot has to have 50% commercial if you subdivide.
Just as like another like a nuance that I'm thinking of here, and I know we're diving into this probably further than we should be at the moment, but for with industrial commercial and industrial specifically, building square footage is not really indicative of the use of the property, like the industrial use of the property. For Gene's sawmill, he might have 15,000 square foot of buildings, but there's really like 80,000 square feet or 100,000 square feet of like actively worked area. Does that make sense? So how would we deal with that for percent?
So it'd be a structural thing. It wouldn't be your yard or anything along those lines.
So if we had like unhoused sawmills and stuff where there's like actively permanently mounted equipment on like concrete pads, but they're not covered, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I don't have a vested interest one way or the other, but I feel like that the industrial, commercial to a lesser extent, obviously we don't want like parking trailers on there or parking equipment to cover, you know, a use that's not necessarily a use, but
Right.
but at
I
the same
think- I
time, I
think
mean,
with-
if you have a yard like a Jay Hutchins yard, I mean, they could be the amount of work they actually do at their property is not necessarily the amount of work and employees that company does is not necessarily directly related to the size of the building. So if they were to do housing, it seems reasonable at face value to tie it to the square footage, but it doesn't seem like it really addresses the nature of the 50-50 where we're trying to, I don't know.
Well, what it does
Yeah.
is it limits the amount of residential. I mean,
Sure.
you know, because if you have a building that's 10,000 square feet, then
It's still a
you
lot
know,
of residential. So yeah, I guess ultimately
that's
it's never going to
it's
be
50%. If you have 80,000 square feet, you're not going to want to put half of 80,000 into
I
housing.
won't. Someone will, but yeah. Okay, that's a good point. I guess the amount,
So,
the
but
volumes of square footage you're talking about just kind of make the residential not necessarily a big limit there. So
I think it's a building thing, but we could look at that a little bit more. I mean, we can look at that in the subdivision question
but
a
anyway,
little more
sorry, not to muddy the waters.
see if we
Yeah.
can tie
Thanks
it
a lot.
down.
Okay.
All right, so any more questions on that? So we'll just look at this last piece here. In the PUD section, it currently says a master development plan for any portion of the parcel or lot not proposed for land development needs a master development plan, a master development plan. So it's been troublesome for Tyler to get people to understand that it is only at the time of application. What do you have planned? So for instance, to take the Donovans and the Beals, at the master plan that the Donovans would present here would be their lot, which is 10 acres, with the Beals lot marked out, which let's say is 1 acre. The remaining 9 acres, including the Donovan's house, they just show as remaining land, and that is what counts as the master plan. And that's okay, because that's all that's known at this time. However, in 3 years, if they want to make another lot for another one of their offspring, they would have to go back and amend the master development plan to show this other lot. So this is spelled out here. So there's a slight encouragement for people who are going to put multiple lots to do it all at once. So, you know, if the Donovans wanted to, they could plot out 3 lots right now. And that would save them having to go back to the DRB and amend their master plan sooner rather than later, if you see what I mean. But it's okay for a developer just to say, this is all I have in my mind right now is this one lot, and the rest is undeveloped. That's an acceptable master development plan, as long as the applicant knows that when and if they decide they want to do something with the rest of that, they come and they amend their master development plan.
Yeah.
So this just makes it a little clearer as to what the procedure is, and when the neighbors come and say, well, you're not telling us everything you're going to do with this lot. There's no way that people can tell everything they're going to do with a lot at the time that they want to make a change to it. You can't force them to make a plan they don't have. So this just shows the people who want to complain about that there is a plan for them to come back and amend it when they have more plans in mind. The option that Tyler would prefer is we just get rid of this altogether, that we don't require a so-called master plan or conceptual plan in a PUD. Personally, I think that would be harder to sell politically, that there's nothing that counts as a plan, because some PUDs might actually have a master plan. They're going to put this here, they're going to divide this lot here, they're going to put 3 houses here, you know, whatever it is they're going to do, there actually is a master plan where you need to show the roads and stuff, because you have that in your mind to do it. And if you have it all planned out at one sitting, you will only have to make the one master plan unless you want to change things. So, you know,
I would say it's a clarifying statement for this, because the key word that is really messing us up is conceptually. And this is also in the subdivision regulations too, which we're not dealing with now. We're only dealing with the PUD at this point. So I just want to just reiterate that this is just more of a declarative statement, and you don't have to show something that's conceptual. You have to show what you're going to do, what you're there for right then and there. The remaining lands, it's just stating if you're going to do any development there, you have to come back, which you have to do anyway.
but it just makes it clear right up front that this is the process, and that, you know, so if you're worried about what's going to happen later, you will have a chance to weigh in on it, because there will be another DRB meeting with public input on your new plan now. So that the neighbors are still going to have a chance to weigh in on it at the amendment hearing. So
Yeah,
hopefully,
I like the language.
all right. So for next time, is there anybody who is opposed to adding these same changes into the C district? Is anyone who's opposed to that?
No.
And it, you know, would just be adding these same, because we have the same ambiguities going in the PUD section right now, the way it is for the C district. So, okay, so we'll bring a version of this that adds those in, which is the C district changes, and then we put the letter down here in the C and the IC district. So we'll do that, and then we'll really examine the language about the mixed use PUDs to make sure that every eventuality is covered. Whether you subdivide or not, you can't then make residential only lots out of anything that as of this date is either undeveloped or in commercial use. So we'll look at that carefully, and then we would like to have the lawyer review it to see if he has any issues with it.
So I sent an attachment late in the day today, and it was a motion. We're not going to do that now because we got to run this language past you folks again. But that is pretty much dictates what the next step is after you folks accept this, and we just wanted to give you that clarity and the public clarity that this is how we're going to proceed. So you know, we need to get the blessing of the board before we do that motion, and we're not going to do it right now because we don't have all the language in front of you.
But this is a good opportunity to bring up any other issues with the language that we do have. Mark.
I'm just looking, maybe if we could get consensus from the board tonight to agree to those changes as we have them outlined, if it would be possible to get them written and then approved by the lawyers so that we can actually just vote it through at our next meeting. Is that your game?
Yeah.
You want to front
That's the
end
game. That's the game, is to write the changes to make it foolproof, and the C district run it by the lawyer before our next meeting and have his comments available at our next meeting, as well as a final sign off and set up the public hearing date. I would like tonight to hear from the Beals if they're here. Are they here still?
I do want to note the time, Madam Chair.
Yes, I know. We've got 4 minutes to hear from the Beals.
No, they're not here.
They're not here?
Nope. They probably nodded off.
Okay.
I know the
And
feeling.
the other thing that we will do in this 2-week period is we're going to write a memo to all the property owners in the IC district. Well, if we do the C district, it'll have to be in the C district as well. So we'll have to think about, it's a lot of property owners to telling them what we're doing.
Yeah, the
So
specific property owners. Yep.
the specific property owners, so that they're aware of what we're doing. They may not know that it's really any change from what there already is, but we're hoping to outline it clearly enough so that they see what they can't do and what they can do with the PUD, which they haven't really been able to tell from the current language what they can and can't do because it's not clear. So that was the other thing besides the lawyer. Yeah, Keith.
Yeah, that's, I mean, so this is not something that's a requirement. It's something that we want to do to get, make sure we have full disclosure on what we're doing. I mean, there are certain baselines that we want to do. We're going above and beyond on that to sending these letters out. So.
Yeah, and I would like to have a brief discussion with the Donovans. It is a way forward for them. They were hoping just with residential uses would be permitted. Well, we decided not to do that, but they can still, this is a way for them to do what they want to do. So we're hoping that that works for them.
Fantastic.
All right. So I think that's where we're going to leave it for tonight. The other things we will take up at our next meeting, which is going to be on the 18th of November. Anybody have any last minute comments or real urgent things they need to say?
I would say that thanks to Chris for setting up the Jericho. I mean, that was pretty informative, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
No,
it was great.
My pleasure. I thought they had a good story to tell. I'm glad that people enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great, Chris. Curious to see like where it goes with the town. It seems like the town's got a lot of buy-in, so it's really
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. Well, and also they have enough people on these committees to do these things. I mean, going and talk to landowners, that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. Housing committee, that all of that, getting that buy-in. This is the housing
starts
committee.
with
Our
recruitment.
affordable housing committee right now has 3 people on it, and one of them is me, which I don't have that much time for the housing committee. But so, one of their stated goals is get more people on the committee who are actually invested in doing this kind of work. So it's been hard. But anyway,
So
all right.
I would like to move we adjourn.
Okay. Is there a second?
I will second.
Okay. Very good. Is there anyone who is opposed to adjourning? Hearing none, we stand adjourned. We'll see you on the 18th. And if you think of anything else, just let Keith know on this. Otherwise, I'm hoping that we can have a final, that motion next time and set up our public hearing date. So
Yeah, it's going to be
great.
dependent. It's going to be dependent on council's schedule. Keep that in mind. So, but we'll move this forward as quickly as we can. And that's it. Goodbye, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night,
Bye.
everyone.
Yep. See you all later. Allison, you got here. Yay. You made it. Except you're muted right now, but that's okay.
All right, I'm ending.
Yes, I've been here all the time. I just
Yay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm just thinking a lot about this. I think I have fundamental issues over the too much development in the areas that could possibly be flooded. I think that's still
Yes.
bothering me. but
We're going to
that's
talk
another
about
issue.
that.
Yeah,
We're good.
okay.
We
Okay.
have
We're
that
good.
on the agenda to talk about next
Yeah.
time. We,
Yeah.
based on your comments, so we will get to it. So,
Okay. All right.
all right, great. Bye.
Night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.